speakers with us today. And two of those speakers are here right now. Our third speaker is running 5 minutes late, but we will get started anyways and just have them jump in whenever they're able to be here. And our fourth speaker for this panel actually had to drop out this morning, but we have a recorded video from them talking about and answering the questions that we wanted addressed. So we still have input from all four speakers that were supposed to be present at this panel. But yeah, we can get started. I will start by introducing the panel itself, the speakers, and then we can move on to the individual questions. So just to get you guys started about what dissent is and what the politics of dissent are. So dissent is commonly understood as the practice of holding an opinion that is contrary to the one that is officially held. So from Eastern European humanist movements, which led to the making of Charter 77 and the introduction of the Helsinki Accord, to indigenous protests hoping to end the Dakota Access Pipeline project, and the Pashtun Tahaffuz movement in Pakistan, for example, are all cases of practices in dissent, curbing actions of oppressive governmental regimes and helping challenge the normative status quo. That is what the politics of dissent are, and that is hopefully what we will be discussing today. We have four different speakers representing differing perspectives on the politics of dissent in the spaces that they occupy, either as academics, as activists, and as organizers. Our first speaker is Athar Zia. Professor Athar is a political anthropologist, poet, short fiction writer, and columnist. She's an associate professor in the Department of Anthropology and the Gender Studies program at the University of Northern Colorado, Greeley. Athar is the author of Resisting Disappearances, Military Occupation and Women's Activism in Kashmir, which won the 2020 Gloria Anzaldúa Honorable Mention Award and the 2021 Public Anthropologist Award. She's the co-editor of Can You Hear Kashmiri Women Speak?, Resisting Occupation in Kashmir, and A Desolation Called Peace, which is also up for grabs as a result of the panel today. So if you're here at this panel, we will be distributing 50 books out to folks that are attending this panel. 50 of Athar's books will be given out. She's also the founder of Kashmir Lit and is the co-founder of Critical Kashmir Studies Collective, an interdisciplinary network of scholars working on the Kashmir region. Our second speaker is Rafiullah Kakkar, who is a public policy and development professional with specialization in public policy reform and development, institutional development, conflict resolution, and political economy analysis. He has provided technical assistance and policy advice to the government of Balochistan on education reforms, public-private partnerships, and the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor and education reforms. He has also worked with the Commonwealth Secretariat London, and he has published papers and book chapters on the political economy of ethnic conflict in Balochistan and Pakistan. He also writes commentaries on politics and development issues for leading English dailies in Pakistan and was the 2013 Rhodes Scholar. Amar is our third speaker. Amar Ali Jan is a historian and activist in Pakistan. His work explores the development of Marxist ideas in the non-European world. He's a member of the Haqooq-e-Khalq movement, a rights-based organization in Pakistan. He's a regular columnist whose work has appeared in the News International, Al Jazeera, and the Jacobin. Our fourth speaker, who's unable to be here today, is Ajit Sahi. He is a veteran journalist and civil rights activist from India who has worked with numerous TV and news channels as well as newspapers and news agencies, conducted extensive reporting on police brutality against Indian minorities, especially Muslims, under the guise of terrorism. Ajit is unable to be here in person, as I said, but we have a recorded response from him, which I will be playing for you all. Before I go on any further, our event is sponsored by Yale Poynter Fellowship, which is basically Yale's Journalism Institute, and they sort of sponsor any events that are at the intersection of academia and journalism. So we're really, really grateful for the Poynter Fellowship for helping us fund today's panel as well. Before I move into the questions, I will be playing Ajit's video response, which talks about the Indian state and how it has used force to quash dissent throughout India's history and how people have resisted against this oppression. So let me know if you all can see and hear this.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for inviting me to this panel organized by the South Asia Youth Initiative. I'm very happy to be here and very happy to join my co-panelists here. The topic that I have been given to talk about is dissent and the history of dissent in India. Now, of course, as of this moment, it is Narendra Modi, the Indian Prime Minister, who has probably unleashed the worst crackdown on dissent or on merely free expression of free speech in India in at least a generation. But it is not Narendra Modi who is the harbinger of crackdown on dissent on the Indian subcontinent. It might interest all of you to remember that the first ever law that was written in India against dissent was in 1870, and this still stands on the statute of the Indian Penal Code. It is section 124A, and I'm going to read it. It says, "Whoever by words either spoken or written or by signs or by visible representation or otherwise brings or attempts to bring into hatred or contempt or excites or attempts to excite disaffection towards the government established by law in India shall be punished with imprisonment for life, to which a fine may be added," etc., etc., etc. So basically, this was the law about spreading disaffection against government established by law in India. This law was the law under which many political leaders during the India's freedom struggle had been charged and were imprisoned, including Mahatma Gandhi, who was tried in 1922 under this law. And famously, in this case, which was later came to be known as the Great Ahmedabad Trial, Mahatma Gandhi famously said, "Affection cannot be manufactured by law." And yet, this law has stood the test of time. In, I think, 1958 or thereabouts, the Allahabad High Court actually struck down this section 124A, and yet it was restored by the Supreme Court of India in 1964. So 62 or 64. So even though this law was repealed, was struck as null and void by the High Court, the Supreme Court restored it. And this is the law that is even now being used to put people away in prison. Of course, and this law, section 124A, was written by the British in 1870. So that's how old it is. It's 150 years old, right? And after that, the British wrote the Government of India Defence Act in 1915, which introduced the concept of arrest without trial, indefinite detention. Now, detention is a bad word. It basically means putting people in jail, right? Indefinite means you don't have to bring them before a judge, you don't have to bring them before a magistrate. And all of these are features of successive laws in India. So this was in 1915. And then in 1919, 4 years after the Government of India Defence of India Act was introduced by the British, and this was in the middle of the First World War, they brought what was infamously called the Rowlatt Act, which basically brought Mahatma Gandhi to prominence. And there was widespread rejection of that law in India. And that law, again, it just strengthened the key principles of crushing dissent, which is indefinite detention and incarceration without ever bringing anybody to trial. Now, this was the Rowlatt Act. The Government of India Defence Act, the Defence of India Act, was reintroduced in 1930s. I think this was at the start or just before the beginning of the Second World War. Interestingly, in the United Kingdom, where a similar law was introduced by the British back in the early 1900s, that law has been repealed. But of course, the successor laws here in India, not only they continue, but unfortunately, they have been strengthened over the decades. Now, Jawaharlal Nehru was India's first prime minister, and he is talked up as a great Democrat, which he was. But at the same time, it was he who brought the law called Armed Forces Special Powers Act, which was basically aimed to crush dissent in the state of Nagaland in Northeast India, where people were boycotting elections. They had boycotted the first elections of India in 1952. They were boycotting the government because they wanted freedom. To crush them, instead of engaging with them and talking with them and bringing them into the favorite term called mainstream, what happened was Jawaharlal Nehru legislated Armed Forces Special Power Act. Subsequently, it was Jawaharlal Nehru who arrested Sheikh Abdullah, the first Prime Minister and then subsequently Chief Minister of Jammu and Kashmir, and put him in prison for 11 years. Indira Gandhi, of course, infamously introduced the emergency, and she brought what was known as the Maintenance of Internal Security Act. And subsequently, she is also the one who brought the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act, which is now the main tool that is used to put people away in prison. So Narendra Modi is, of course, you can say the best practitioner of crushing dissent and crackdown on free speech. But it's been happening in India for more than 100 years. I think what is important for India as a country to put away all of the laws that crush dissent. India needs something like the First Amendment in the United States. We need to remember Mahatma Gandhi's words that affection cannot be manufactured by law. Thank you so much.
Awesome. That was Ajit talking about the history of the anti-dissent laws in India and how they've affected dissent in the country. So now we can just sort of move on to the questions and have answers from our speakers here. We have Arthur, we have Rafiullah here, as well as Amar. Thank you so much for joining us today. And we will head on to the first question. So the first question that I wanted to ask, and this is sort of a precursory question and sort of precursory to the rest of the questions that we are anticipating for today's panel. But the question is, can each of you speak a little bit about what dissent means to every single one of you, and why a practice of dissent is essential in today's econopolitical sphere? I'm gonna invite Rafiullah to get started, and then we will move on to the other speakers.
Thank you very much, Iman, for organizing this very useful panel discussion. And thank you for inviting me to speak on the panel. It's a great honor to be part of such a distinguished panel. I'll begin with the explanation that please accept my apologies in advance as I may have to run during the discussion for cater for an urgent family emergency of a COVID case. So now let me respond to your question. I think as a political activist, I believe dissent is an active part, a critical component of active citizenship. The foundation of the modern state rests on a contract between the citizens and the state, which is publicly or widely known as a social contract. I won't go into the details of the social contract theory, but this theory has evolved from Socrates until till the 20th and 21st century, but it has survived. So the ensuring compliance with this state-citizen contract can be achieved. Compliance can be ensured only when the state or the power elites, the people, the elites who wield power and exercise power on behalf of the citizens are held accountable. And that accountability can be achieved when we have an active citizenry. So for an active citizenry, I believe dissent is a defining feature of active citizenry. And it is a bit unfortunate that most of us have sort of reduced the role of a citizen to just uncritically absorbing and following and processing the instructions and orders and information issued by the state. And I think dissent is particularly important for socially disadvantaged and minority groups, because state at the end of the day is not a neutral institution. It exercises powers on behalf of the people, and people have their own biases and prejudices. And as a result, the state, those biases and prejudices are also sort of carried into the state structures as well. So the state doesn't in practice act as a neutral arbiter between competing social groups, which means that disadvantaged social groups, minority social groups are often at the receiving end, and therefore it is very important for representatives of the majority as well as the minority groups to be active citizens, to hold power elites accountable for their actions and policies, and that can be done through expressing your views freely and independently, and criticizing state policies and actions if they in any way hurt the interests of the citizens. So for me, dissent is a very critical and key part of active citizenship. And I think in multi-ethnic, heterogeneous countries like Pakistan, dissent is more important to protect the interests and fundamental rights of citizens. And I would emphasize again, especially the rights and interests of minority groups, because we know, as the famous maxim goes, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And this is something that has been on display in Pakistan as well. As a political activist in Pakistan, I believe we have seen the abuse and misuse of power at multiple levels throughout the history of this country. We have seen ethnic minorities facing discrimination, facing racial profiling, and also unfair and unjust distribution of resources. Similarly, we have seen religious minorities in Pakistan facing discrimination, which has been unfortunately legalized and institutionalized. Similar is the case with women in Pakistan and other marginalized groups in Pakistan. People from the lower income groups or lower social classes also face sort of systemic exclusion in the way policies are designed and implemented. And that is why I think it is very important for members of these communities to become active citizens and make dissent an active ingredient of that active citizenship.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you for talking about and sort of prefacing the conversation on dissent and what it means specifically for marginalized communities in places that have authoritative power like Pakistan. I will now move on to Author and invite her to speak on what dissent means to her and why it's important in the current political economic sphere.
Thank you, Iman, and thank you everyone for organizing this panel. And I'm really happy to be here and listen to everyone. I think Ajit laid a good foundation for us to think about dissent and what it means in context when we think about India. And Rafiullah has talked about his region of where he works and is active in. I kind of want to build on the ideas that already have been put on the table, and also think from the vantage of being in Kashmir, like thinking about Kashmir as well, because I feel like dissent is also contextual. Of course, it means variance with the powers that be. But here's the thing, like when you think about dissent, you're thinking about variance, and you're really not thinking about a lot about the consequences. Like dissent in itself means variance with whatever is the mainstream viewpoint or whatever. But then the other side of it is resistance. And I feel like I think about dissent, I use the word a lot less than I use the word resistance, because that's what Kashmir makes me think about when I think about dissent. The other important thing that dissent in Kashmir, or for a Kashmiri, or thinking about Kashmir history, or even the history of dissent in the subcontinent, dissent is everything when we think about it as resistance. So the other thing that I also wanted to talk about that Ajit already kind of touched upon is this history of dissent a little bit. I don't know if the question is asking for that as well. Do you think, or should we?
I welcome all analysis is welcome, yes.
Okay, so I think that's very important. I just wanted to build upon that a little bit. When you think about dissent from a Kashmiri vantage, it's kind of inbuilt into the Kashmiri system or cultural fabric to kind of speak truth to the power, whether you are able to do that or not, and the consequences that you suffer, that's a separate question. But Kashmiris have always expressed their dissent, and that's what has been the key goal of the government of India to manage somehow, to kind of get this resistance out and get a more compliant people out of these Kashmiris. So that's not happened. And why hasn't that happened? Not because that hasn't happened because India has already put into place a lot of laws that curb dissent. Right now, when you think about Kashmiris, especially in the West, it's very easy for the Western audiences to think about Kashmiri movement as terrorism. It's uncritically accepted many times, the word for Kashmiri militants or combatants or fighters or quote unquote mujahids as the people in Kashmir call them. So Ajit talked about the history of dissent. And when he talks about Nehru and he talks about Indira Gandhi, and he also mentioned Kashmir briefly, I think that's very important for us to consider that when we think about India, we usually are taken up by this idea of a democracy. And dissent is it's the heart, it's the blood and heart, and all the organs of democracy work through dissent, because that's how you get an opinion, and that's how you get your word out, and you kind of get a representation of all these people, especially if you have a representative system. So thinking in those terms, and then thinking the democracy that India is, I feel like as students who are inheriting a future, as a generation that is going to inherit a future, inherit the subcontinent in so many ways and the world, I think it's time to kind of come face to face with what India is, and what India's history is. Like when we think about history, when we think about India, we usually think about a post-colonial nation, and we think about the subaltern in social sciences, this huge term. I'm not negating the history of colonialism as it imposed on people, but at the same time, what kind of India did Indians inherit in 1947, and what did it do to other people? And that's how dissent kind of manifests for us. So Ajit gave an example of Section 125A, and he talked about AFSPA, which is the Armed Forces Special Powers Act. Let me take your attention to another thing that happens inside Kashmir. Or that is also a feature of the Constitution of India, which is the Charter of Fundamental Rights. India's fundamental rights are very unique in having a clause again for administrative detention. And that's how it actually entered Kashmir. So in 1950s, when the Article 370, which recently was taken away by the government of India unilaterally and militarily, at that time, what happened was that India negotiated Article 370 with client politicians of Kashmir. So that wasn't like the whole representation of Kashmir. It was a section of client politicians. And through that special autonomous system, what India also did was through presidential executive orders, it entered the Fundamental Rights Charter inside Kashmir. And that has a special clause for any kind of dissent that threatens India's sovereignty. You can penalize that person by putting them in under administrative detention. And as Ajit already mentioned, that these detentions, it's a very mild word to use, but these are indefinite detentions. They're revolving door detentions. So that's when you kind of see the criminalization of dissent starting in Kashmir. Even the person who actually negotiated Article 370, he was put in jail by Nehru, as Ajit already mentioned. So you kind of have to think about India not from, as he said, that Modi is the best practitioner of all these laws that are, but I also think he's not just the best practitioner. I think they've already been practiced on Kashmiris in the best possible manner that India could. He's just a more brazen practitioner. He makes it a spectacle. When Kashmir's autonomy was recently taken away in 2019, the people from Congress, which is Nehru's party, one of the politicians said that, they didn't really need to make a military spectacle out of it. We've done this 12 times and no one even knows. So that's kind of the policy that India has had. So going back to thinking about dissent, so dissent inside Kashmir was criminalized, like you see in Nagaland that Ajit already talked about. So AFSPA, the Armed Forces Special Powers Act, that was of 1958, that was imposed on Nagaland, was also imposed on Kashmir in 1991. And you have other laws that have come in ever since that criminalize basically free expression, that criminalize even breathing, not just, if a Kashmiri breathes, it's a threat to India's sovereignty. That's the level of repression that you have at the moment. So when we think about dissent in India, or thinking in terms of Kashmir or other issues connected to India, I feel like we have to think about what social scientists have called colonial constitutionalism, that the heart of India's constitution, it might have all those wonderful words that make it a republic and a democracy and all of that, but we also have to look at the colonial constitutionalism that feeds all of those processes, that is allowing India to be what it is now, and which is a new imperialist power. And for lack of a better vantage, the way we try to understand it, because we use the vantage of democracy and how it's trying to get to that democratic point, it kind of like makes us go towards a different direction. But the fact that if we look at it from a colonial constitutional perspective, it's a different thing altogether. And that's why you see dissent from Delhi and everywhere criminalized, so to speak. But we do have to mention here one thing, that the dissent inside Kashmir is a different kind of dissent. It's not the same dissent as the Indian Muslims have, or the other marginalized or minorities inside India have. So that's something that we need to consider. And now I move on to maybe Amar. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Arthur. So just to contextualize this as well, I don't want people to think that we're talking about 4 different issues simultaneously. Rafi offered us a really important perspective on why dissent allows for the centering of marginalized voices in authoritarian countries. Arthur has pointed us to this idea of why is it really important to look towards a constitutional history of anti-dissent laws that is entrenched in a democratic country like India, and how that informs dissent politics. And we're hoping that Amar can also push us towards thinking about how dissent is affected in academic spaces and the work that he's been doing with labor unions as well as student unions in Pakistan. So we are offering you a lot of these very differing perspectives on dissent in a lot of different political stratospheres, but we do want there to be like an overarching connection, and I'm hoping that folks are able to see that as well. But thank you, Amar. Please, whenever you feel like stepping in.
Thank you so much, Iman. Assalamu alaikum to everyone. Hello. Thank you for arranging this panel. I heard Jeet Saab speak earlier, and it was a very important history narration that he did, because those things are something that a lot of young people don't know about. We've been kept away from our own history. Rafi, of course, is a friend and an inspiration who's been working for marginalized ethnicities in Pakistan. And of course, Atharv has been educating all of us on one of the most repressed issues of our times. I mean, Kashmir is something that is not only, the repression is not just happening from India, but it's also happening in the global discourse. It does not get the same kind of coverage, the same kind of language that a colonial occupation of that scale deserves in the global sphere. So thank you so much for those talks. And I'll just briefly say, first, the idea of dissent. I think it goes back to the idea of the people in modernity. So you have 2 conceptions of the people. One is a fictional conception of the people, a category constructed by the state, where the state decides who are the people, and more importantly, who are not the people, who are the categories of people, of individuals, of communities who are excluded from the community of the people. So from the national community, from the ethnic community, from the religious community. And this very idea of excluding communities or individuals from the legitimate political community opens up space for violence, opens up space for even genocide, and opens up space for all kinds of authoritarianism that we've seen over the past 200 years, and particularly now, all in the name of a people, of a majoritarian, masculine, fictitious people. And this is something we see all the way from India to Pakistan to America to Israel. You have this state-led concept of the people. I think dissent or resistance, as Athar Zia called it, I think that opens up the possibility of a different kind of a people that is not being interpolated or being controlled by the state. A people that is a product of a refusal, a rupture from the status quo. A people that comes into existence because of its defiance of the world as it is. And that idea of a people, that category of a people, which is a people in becoming, which is a people that's held together in its sorrows, in its suffering, but it's also in its refusal to give up, That is the concept of the people that has actually made constitutionalism, republicanism, anti-colonialism such exciting ideas over the last 200 years. And I think that is the tradition that a lot of us come from, the tradition of dissent, the tradition of refusal, the tradition of not accepting the definition of people as given by those in power, but by actually thinking of the category of the people from the margins, from those that those in power do not accept as the people. And this is something, I mean, you can say not only if we talk about the subcontinent, not just Kashmir, of course, is one of the worst examples of that. You could also say that about, to a certain degree, about Telangana in India. I mean, the kind of violence that happened in 48, or the kinds of violence that happens against marginalized communities throughout subcontinent. We are not a free people. And this is then a battle between a state-led project of a people versus a people in becoming, which is the category of the people who are fighting back and who are dreaming of a different world. Because you pointed out the issue of academia, so I'll just briefly talk about that. We are at a moment in history where the bourgeoisie or the ruling classes around the world no longer have the pretension of creating a new culture, a new order like they did in the 18th or 19th centuries, where universities mattered, where dissent mattered, where you could have some kind of a Kantian figure or Hegel or so many other figures within these universities. We are dealing with a ruling class that has lost all sense of honor, all sense of dignity, all sense of culture, and which is treating a vast majority of the people, especially younger folks, as disposable, as surplus populations, which is why today the youth across the world is becoming more of a law and order problem. And this is something I saw in universities in Pakistan throughout. Young people are not seen as assets, not seen as citizens, as human beings who have exciting ideas to bring to the table. They are not even seen as potential people with potential careers, because there are very few jobs for young people now in Pakistan. They are often seen as a law and order problem, which then slides into a national security problem, which is why we increasingly saw the invocation of anti-terror laws against students in Pakistan. When students, as you know, in 2019 protested across Pakistan for the restoration of student unions, which were banned in 1984. Sedition charges were brought against students and teachers. And this is something that Ajit Saab was talking about. And I was also charged with sedition, 124A, I'm out on bail. And as he was rightly pointing out, this is a colonial law, which carries a life sentence. And I have the honor of being thrown out of 3 universities. So I'm a master at that now. And the last time when finally the intelligence officials held a dialogue with me, they said, our problem with you is that you discuss politics in your classrooms. So don't do that. I said, I'm willing to do that. The only problem is I teach political science. So you give me a method where I can teach political science without discussing politics. So you really have this ruling class, which is not only cruel, it's also intellectually mediocre. And in a world that is so mediocre, that is so bankrupt, that is being run by people who are cruel and ready to exercise the most excessive forms of violence, I think it is the only moral, ethical path that a citizen can take is to defend the right to dissent, because we cannot accept that this is the best humanity can do. We cannot accept that this is the best Pakistan can do. We can't accept this to be the best possible option for young people. We must resist. We must respect and celebrate dissent. And we must keep the imagination alive for a better future, because now they're with the dismantling of the education system across the world, and particularly in Pakistan, they're not just targeting physically people. They are also destroying our imagination. They are ending the possibility of imagining a different world, and we must not let them win. Thank you.
Thank you, Amar, for all those comments. Again, I just want to invite everyone to think about these things as interconnected with one another, even though they might seem a little bit disparate. Amar brought to us this idea of the moralism behind asking for the right to dissent, and why that is becoming increasingly important in a world that is changing people's value into mere exchange values and making them into like economic agents, right? So we're thinking about a lot of these different things, but it's really important that you still keep it connected. I was going to ask another question about the history of dissent in a lot of the different spaces that you're working in. But one great thing about having an academic panel is that they sort of preempt all of your questions and answer them when you ask them one. So I think people got to that. And because the purpose of SAI is to really help students think about how to agitate, how to organize, and how to resist themselves, I think the second question that I want to invite our speakers to think about is a practice of dissent and how it can sort of be enacted by young people in whatever spaces where they are at, before we open to general questions. So the question is, as we know, dissenting voices are often sidelined. They lack mass support because of entrenched state power and its capitalization on and access to tools for propaganda and mass education. How can we build movements that center on dissent, but also are able to garner large-scale support to overthrow the status quo? And part of asking this question is to take us from the pessimism of the first responses that we heard about how dangerous and perilous the situation of the world that we live in is, and move towards possible ways of resistance, as is practiced by all of the wonderful speakers that we have here. Again, I'm going to start by inviting Rafi Ullah to speak about how is it that we can engage in a practice of dissent, also informed by how you have engaged in practices of dissent in the spaces that you're in. But thank you so much, and whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Iman. I think it was a great pleasure to listen to the other distinguished panelists. They have laid a very solid theoretical foundation for this debate. I think in authoritarian states like Pakistan and many other in South Asia, practicing dissent can have very serious repercussions and consequences for political activists. And these consequences range on a spectrum from the sort of the lesser consequences that result in damaging your economic interests or that hurt you personally and emotionally, to the more serious and extreme ones that can result in the loss of lives and that endanger the lives of activists. So, and these in those of us who have been living in authoritarian states, they have actually experienced and seen some of these threats. And my dear friend Amar, who just spoke brilliantly, he is one of the examples of those who are here in this discussion. He's a highly qualified, well-educated Pakistani who made a deliberate choice to return to the country, unlike many of these expat diaspora Pakistanis who deliver lectures of patriotism while enjoying the comforts of the whatever countries they are sitting in, and they give us lectures on patriotism and Hubul Watni, or the greater national interests, and in a very condescending tone, in a condescending manner. And so Amar came here and he became part of the public sector universities. And as somebody residing in Lahore, he was a very active supporter and defender of the rights of minorities in Pakistan. He spoke for every oppressed group, regardless of their color, language, religion, and sect. And he has been paying a huge price for it. So, and Amar is just one example. And Amar is still lucky in the sense that he has, at least he's living in, he has survived and he lives on. And which is these are the small mercies that we need to be happy for in the context that we live in. In areas like Balochistan, unfortunately, people are not as privileged as Amar and myself are. Many activists here, they go unnamed and unnoticed. They get disappeared, they get killed, and nobody even gets to know about them. So the consequences and the repercussions of exercising dissent in an authoritarian state are real, and we have witnessed many examples of it. Now, the question is, I think this is a very tough question. I'm not entirely sure if I can live up to the hopes of optimism that Iman, you just shared. Building inclusive social movements is a very, very challenging and Herculean task. In states like Pakistan, where the state is authoritarian to the core and doesn't shy away from using all possible legal and illegal means to suppress dissent and to curb difference of opinion and to curb free speech and media. This is the state on the one end, and on the other end, the ruling elites, again, Amar brilliantly explained it, how the ruling elites in Pakistan have also lost all sort of credibility and legitimacy, and their susceptibility and vulnerability to be co-opted on every occasion has also kind of disillusioned and disenchanted the citizens, especially the young people in the country. Third, the challenge in a context like Pakistan is the multiple fault lines of identity that we face in ethnically, tribally, religiously diverse countries. Building horizontally inclusive movements is a huge challenge because people are divided along ethnic, tribal, sectarian, and religious lines. And the state has used curriculum, media, and all other resources at its disposal to sort of manufacture consent in the Gramscian sense, and a non-ideological politics, a politics that is based on conformity to the ugly and narrowly defined majoritarian narratives. That politics has become the politics of the mainstream politics. And even those people who are at the receiving end, who are the losers of this kind of politics, have kind of come to accept it. As our friend has written a book, The Politics of Common Sense, Asim Sajjad, all this politics, the non-ideological politics that is based on pursuing petty interests of the ruling elites, has become the politics of common sense and has been accepted by a large sort of majority. There is a lot of hope, particularly given the young people in this country. Countries like Pakistan are experiencing a youth bulge, and young people are clearly disillusioned and disenchanted with the current state of affairs, with the status quo. They want to do something about it. There is no space, there is no environment for them to take any action or to organize a large political or social movement. Despite these challenges, I think there is a small window of opportunity. I think Amar would be in a very better position to speak about it, but I just want to give my opinion. Unfortunately, given my experience in this country, I am not very hopeful about the future of these movements, given the challenges that we just mentioned, both on the part of the state and the hollowness and the state of our political or ruling elites. I think the only hope that I can give to the young people here is that I think, first of all, we need to understand and appreciate that the issue of protection of the rights of minorities and disadvantaged groups cannot be left to the discretion and sweet will or goodwill of the ruling elites. And the history of this country, the history of this country clearly tells us that the ruling elites have failed to protect the interest of any disadvantaged group in this country. So if that is the case, we need to be vigilant in what we can do. I think there are a range of options. First of all, we need to have clarity that we need to begin with constitutional and legal safeguards for all disadvantaged groups and minorities. Then we need to have a very active and independent civil society, political parties, and media to make sure that those constitutional and legal safeguards are complied with and that the rights are protected in letter and spirit. Third, as we know that the ruling elites in the state would probably not allow us to do this, what we need to do, I think there is no quick fix, there is no magic solution, but one thing we need to understand and appreciate is that organization, becoming part of grassroots movements, and mobilizing and organizing people, reaching out to the communities is the only way probably to get rid of these challenges of authoritarianism without organizing, without mobilizing people. I do not see any other alternative or a shorter way. The social media has given us an alternative medium. It has given us an opportunity to push the boundaries of permissible discourse, to push the limits of permissible discourse. But even social media has recently come under censorship and under control by authoritarian states. And also, some young people at times think that social media is the end in itself. I think social media is just an important part of a wider sort of strategy to reach out to the people, but it should not be, and it cannot be a substitute for grassroots organization and mobilization. So my concluding sort of suggestion and humble remark is that we cannot bring sustainable social change without organizing and without mobilizing communities and people. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rafeela, for talking about the need for grassroots organization and how the same kind of technocratization that makes all of us susceptible to state powers can also be mobilized in ways like things like social media that are useful for these movements as well. Yeah, I'm going to move on to Arthur for any comments that you might have to offer for how folks can engage in a politics of dissent.
So was there a pointed question or just this? I remember it was a longer question. Do you want to repeat that, or is it?
Yeah, the question was sort of along the lines of what are like specific tools and skills that you feel young people in different spaces can mobilize to like agitate, dissent, and organize against issues within like the status quo, irrespective of obviously where the speakers are, because everyone's bringing in a lot of different perspectives.
Yeah, so this is maybe, I don't know if to either answer this specifically in thinking about Kashmir, or maybe this is just a general question. I feel like not having to dissent if you feel like, you know, you are conforming to what is happening around you and things don't really seem to matter to you a lot, I think that's a problem. But if you are thinking about things that create discomfort in you, like when you wake up in the morning and there are several things that you see happening in the media, happening outside in your community, I feel like those are very important things to consider and reflect on. Are they making you uncomfortable? And if they are, what do you do about it? Is it that you're going to be, protesting, or, some sort of agitation or some sort of a response is needed? And I think anyone who is reflective of their own positionality and privilege, and anyone who is, thinking about the outside world, has so many reasons to be uncomfortable throughout the day. I feel like ours is a more that we are more modern and we are so keyed in and clued in with each other through computers and internet and all of that. I feel at the same time, we are a more uncomfortable population in that sense, because we know so much and we have this glut of information that goes in every day, and we don't know what to do with that. And there's so much that needs to be done. Like, there's like these larger problems that are facing humanity, thinking about environmental disasters. Sometimes when I think about Kashmir, I feel like it won't be long that it's going to be left to people to decide what's going to happen to this region, because environment might take charge, and something might happen, and we won't have this region the way we think about it, because the way the disaster is going. So there's so much that we can think about throughout the day, and then also I feel like it's only a few people who cannot afford to think about what happens throughout the day that doesn't affect them or other people. So when I think about my own positionality and the reason, when we have these conversations, a lot of people do think about your positionality, like, why are you dissenting? How is it affecting you? Like Rafeela was talking about the political elites, Kashmir also has a lot of elites that are the client politicians of India. And if you are embedded in those circles, you really don't need to have a lot of dissent. You could just kind of like multiply the power that India gives you and live your life comfortably. And that is right now, as we are speaking here, there was a fashion show that was going on that was kind of like portrayed as if it was the emancipation of the entire Kashmiri population. But on the other hand, there was also an encounter going on, and people have a civil curfew in the nights, civil in the sense because it's for COVID. But again, we know that it's just a masquerade for militarization and occupation. So to think about Kashmir, I feel like, there's that Howard Zinn quote that you cannot be neutral on a burning train. So I feel like that's why I feel like we are in a moment where the entire world, there's never been a moment in history when it's not like this, but we talk about where we are in our own context and positionality. I feel like we are all on a burning train, and so many things are happening. And we're also a globalized world, not necessarily a closed world. We're necessarily factionalized. Again, we have different, so many positionalities, and we're doing so much of contrasting ideologies that are clashing together. And that is the moment in this history, because we are traveling so much. And Rafieullah talked about diaspora, and that made me smile, because diaspora politics is another layer that gets added to the local fights that you're fighting on a global stage. Sometimes I ask myself, like, why did I even have to leave Kashmir to do this kind of work and be in Western academia, and then to read only Western philosophers and scholars, and kind of get trained in a discipline which is anthropology, which is actually the handmaiden of colonialism. So once I was writing my book, I began thinking about the methodology that I was using. And I thought to myself, would I have been able to do this work 10 years back when I was in Kashmir at that point in time? Now it's almost 17 years. And the other thought that came to me was the ethnography that I was doing as an anthropologist was actually made in the laboratory of colonialism. And now I was going and using the same tools back there. So even, when you start looking at these fractures and the positionalities that you inherit, the intersectionalities, what happens is that you feel like you have to show some sort of dissent everywhere. You cannot really belong. Like if you're inside the academia, if you have to just belong to academia, then you have to conform so much. And I don't think people who have the reflective nature, and they cannot be comfortable, they can never belong, and they can never have labels. So in that sense, I feel like dissent is a part of you. And I'm not going to say that I'm dissenting because I want to leave a better future for my kids. I do have kids, and they're teenagers, and they'll probably, like you all here, you will find your way in this place. No one has to teach you dissent. You're doing that every day. But you just have to see, like, how are you going to optimize these feelings of discomfort, and how are you going to operationalize them? Where are you going to use them and utilize them and deploy them? And it might be a big issues like Kashmir, or it might be a small issue just like something at school. So you are training yourself in that department. And I feel that dissent is already a part of us. We are, as human beings, I mean, dissent is where we arose from, even if we look at it theologically. So I don't think that dissent is going anywhere in that sense. You can never be safe when you are in a position of dissent. You can't really probably travel back to Kashmir, or you can't probably, like Amar has gone back to Pakistan, and that's such a brave position. And I feel so dissent is going to take you in different kinds of discomforts. And I think those are the places to go if you want to just live with yourself at the end of the day. You can have a comfortable life conforming, but at the same time, I feel like that's the most uncomfortable way to live, which is why I feel like, when I came to United States 17, 18 years ago, no one really, like, when we used to go into these academic spaces where we used to say, we want to talk about Kashmir, they would say, you don't really need to talk about Kashmir because there's an India and Pakistan panel happening, so you can just say something there. And we refuse to take that stance, because that's the domination of these big contesting nations over Kashmir has been so much that we had to persist in different ways. Dissent always is not confrontational from the get-go. It is a confrontation, but you do not have to be going all out and guns blazing from the very first moment. So there is a thing in Islam that we kind of talk about, the hikmah, the strategy. So you have to kind of, like, make your own niche and you won't convince all people, and we don't have to go convincing people regarding what we are doing and not. Just keep doing your thing. And here's what I see. How would someone dissent without even like embarking on the project at the moment? Think about India. Think about what India is. And I'm not saying discount Pakistan, but my beef right now is more with India, also with Pakistan in many ways, but with India more, so to speak. So rather than in a position of defense all the time saying, don't call us terrorists, Kashmiris have a genuine resistance movement, just make the line bigger, tell the world what India is, and look at India's new imperialist heart that has really come to fore. So there's so many ways of doing the same labor around this kind of creating a more just subcontinent. And then also thinking about the future of the subcontinent. How does it look? Like earlier, Ajit talked about that affection cannot be manufactured by law, that British were doing with Indians at that time. And not Indians, again, that's a misnomer. What British was doing what British colonialism was doing with British India and the princely states. So they were trying to manufacture love and affection. So at this moment, what we see happening throughout the world is kind of like this manufacture of affection for democracy, whether that's electoral politics, whether that's representative democracy, or whatever kind of liberal democracies or systems you're looking for. I feel like that needs to be interrogated. Like when you think about these big nations, you think about India, you think about Pakistan, you think about 1947 post-colonialism. I feel like more than countries, these places are contraptions. They're kind of like forced together in a way. So could there be some sort of a federalism that that is beyond what we know? Would this be some sort of I don't know, like what I'm trying to say is that envisioning subcontinent as not just these big dominant countries, and thinking about democracy in the way that it's being the level that democracy has been brought to at this present moment, which is not democratic anymore. And when Rafiullah talks about liberal elites and Amar is talking about the sedition issues and all the other issues, that workers' rights and all of that, these don't look like democracies. And thinking about India, it doesn't look like a democracy. To Kashmiris, it hasn't looked like a democracy for the last 72 years. I think at that moment, sort of like the dissent or thinking about a novel idea would also be like, are these countries really real? Is this a realistic way to put people together and rule them and manufacture unity? I know that there is unity in diversity, which is India's big thing, but at the same time, the way that is manufactured at this present moment, that's not the Malayas that India is only facing. That's the Malayas of the entire world at the moment. And I think new generation needs to think about that too, like such behemoth countries that are manufacturing, just living together, pushing people together, and not unifying, but homogenizing in this very dangerous manner. That's something of a challenge that's for all of us. And I think that's what binds us, whether we're looking at Pakistan, whether we're looking at Kashmir, whether we're looking at India or any other place on the planet.
Yeah, thank you so much. So author basically talked about everything from dissent in the everyday life sphere and how you think about your role and in terms of your discomfort with the world as is, to things like manufactured consent towards empty, hollow nationalist democracies like India and Pakistan. Now I'm going to address the same question to Amar. Amar, what do you think are like ways in which dissent can be practiced today by young people? And what is your take on that?
Thank you, Man. First, I think we are living at a moment in history where we also have to overcome this binary of who's inside the country and who's outside. I take Rafi's point, and also what Professor Atta was just saying, that it's important to be self-reflective, but that's also something that people here, privileged people inside Pakistan, India, Kashmir, anywhere, should be self-critical. But you can show solidarity from anywhere. I don't think we're at that moment in history where any one geographical location should have privilege. I made my own decisions. Other people make their own decisions for their own reasons. But we are living in a world that is on fire, literally, that is collapsing. And the only way out of it is some vision of international solidarity. And, when I follow politics and politics of youth in the US, a lot of things that young people have managed to do in the US is very inspirational under very difficult circumstances. I mean, what's happened over the past 4 or 5 years, despite the neo-fascism and right-wing reaction, you've also seen some really inspiring movements, grassroots movements, whether it's school students who are fighting against gun laws, whether it's environmental activists, whether it's people supporting AOC or Bernie, or people are associated with the Women March. There are all kinds of ways in which young people are coming together to refuse the world that is being presented to them, to take it as something that's given or natural. And that's inspiring. And this is happening all over the world. It's happening in Chile, it's happening in India, it's happening in Kashmir, it's happening in Pakistan. You have more and more young people who are negating negating the world given to them by their elders, so that they're opening up the possibility of something new. And that's something that's very, very encouraging, because we're taught to be obedient. Young people today, especially those in the universities, as I said earlier, there's so much criminalization and securitization of campuses and the youth in general, that people are being told to conform. And in such a situation, when people are refusing, it means the system has not won. There's no definitive victory of the system at the moment. There's still space for an alternative. People are imagining it. It's here. You have, someone like Greta, some of these environmental activists in Africa, in Latin America. I mean, you have all kinds of creativity that's coming out of the restlessness that young people feel today, and that is something that we have to celebrate at some level. It's a bleak situation, but the situation is pessimistic. But as thinkers, as activists, we have no option but to choose the side of optimism. It is not a scientific, objective kind of a decision. It is actually a decision in the most raw sense of the term. We choose to be optimistic because we know if we don't, then we are giving up. And the consequences of giving up are massive. So we must hold on to hope. We must hold on to the possibility of something better. And which is why I think today, politics is less the art of the possible. It is more the art of the impossible. We must insist that the impossible, that which is deemed impossible by those in power, is possible. And we can do it, we can embody it. And young people are embodying it all over the world. So why not? Why not hold on to the impossible? In terms of the US, I think a lot of young people who are studying in the US today, not only, I'm sure they're active in politics on campus and issues affecting students and communities in the US, but also you're in a unique position to talk about the world. I mean, this is something, and this is something that I've realized, even with an education abroad. Once I moved back to Pakistan, I know no journal, no international newspaper, no academic conference wants me to talk about anything other than Pakistan. So, when you come back, you're provincialized. I mean, nobody is interested. What's your opinion about Kant, for example, right? Or even if that's what I actually worked on. So they're like, tell me, what do you think about Lahore? What do you think about Pakistan? Yeah. And that's something that happens to us, but that's fine. That's something we will accept for now. But when you're based in the US, when you're based in the West more broadly, you have the possibility of extending solidarity to the entire world, while being critical of the fact that you have this privilege, but at the same time to use that privilege. So it's a dialectical process where you use this privilege to raise issues that other people are not raising, where the media is not raising. It's the issues that are repressed. And this is something I think, I read about the solidarity given by American students to the South African struggle, to the Palestinian struggle. Increasingly, there's more consciousness about the Kashmiri struggle. We need that kind of global imagination that can happen in places like the US, in places like Europe. But also people from across the world should be gearing towards that. But this is something that comes in a way, it's structurally kind of easier for those in the West to do. And I think one very, very important thing is to think beyond the frameworks that are given to us. And this is where Professor Atta just mentioned, I think it's not just important to dissent from the government. It's also important to do an ideological resistance, to dissent from the ideological frameworks that are given to you within even progressive circles within the US. So, she rightly mentioned Subaltern Studies is a fantastic project for the last 30, 40 years that just made this small omission about Kashmir or even about a lot of other things, So it's just even within these circles, you have these massive gaps. And it's important to recognize those. I mean, women in so much of the work that's happened on the war on terror, where women are invisibilized. We have to not only talk about the gaps in the scholarship, but also produce ruptures. The only way to be a good academic in today's world is to actually create ideological ruptures from the dominant narratives, to actually say, we will remain true to anti-colonialism, to feminism, to Marxism, to any kind of theoretical framework that you want, but not by mimicking those in the global north, but actually by rupturing from the dominant narrative and centering the experiences of those in the peripheries who have actually rethought those ideas but have never been acknowledged. I work on Marxism, and it's incredible that the corpus of Marxism is very, very Eurocentric. Yet it's the only theory, European idea, that throughout the 20th century was more popular in the non-European world. I mean, there's no Western Marxist revolution. It happens in Russia, which is on the peripheries. Then Central Asia, all these Muslim countries are debating Marxism in the 1920s, 30s, 40s. You have Eastern Europe, then you have Cambodia, Laos, China, Vietnam, Cuba, Nicaragua, Afghanistan was communist. You have this entire literature that nobody cares about. You have these wonderful Marxist thinkers, feminists, Marxists debating with each other. Nobody's interested. You always are like, okay, what are the French thinking? French Marxists, let's read them. With nothing, I mean, there were cool movements there, but nothing like what happened in Cambodia, what happened in Vietnam, what happened in China, what happened in Afghanistan. Nobody reads anybody from Uzbekistan. We have to recognize the limitations of the corpus, the literature, the content that we're reading in the West, and push ourselves, whether it's feminism, Marxism, nationalism, anti-colonialism. We cannot be lazy today. One of the ethos of being modern, of being militantly modern in the sense of militantly modern, or those who value dissent, is to challenge what we're receiving even within the radical tradition, and to question the gaps. And I think this is something that we have to do. And I must, before I end, I must acknowledge, Iman, that you have shown exemplary solidarity, not just with this event. Last year when we were doing the campaign, you and your friends raised a lot of money for us from Yale, which helped us reach 4,500 families, working class families who had been rendered jobless during the pandemic in Pakistan. And we were able to help them because people like yourself and people from around the world extended solidarity. And it's not the money or whatever, it's the principle of extending solidarity to those who are on the margins. And I think you guys are already doing it. And I hope, and it is I almost assume that more and more people are realizing, as Professor Atta said, that the world is not working as it is. There will be more solidarity, there will be more connections. And despite all the tragedies that we see in our world, the coming years will give us a lot of reason to be optimistic. So we must never lose sight of hope, because that's exactly what the ruling classes want to steal from us. And that's a prized possession that we should never be willing to give up. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amar. I'm so sorry to break this to people, but that is unfortunately all the time we have today. Personally, I feel in the hour that I've been here, I've learned about everything from Gramscian, like consent manufacturing, to universal moralism and the need for that, to thinking about everyday discomfort. So I want to thank all speakers that we had today, from folks like Ajit, who are unable to be here in person, to Arthur, Amar, and Rafiullah, for making us a little more uncomfortable today, for making us think about things that we might be ignoring in our everyday life, and pushing us to think things more critically, irrespective of the spaces that we occupy. So thank you so much to all three of you for your time. And thank you so much to everyone that stayed here for the panel. So happy to think with you all, and looking forward to thinking with you in the future as well.